on the TV.
Hello, my name is Jeff Cohen, Topeka City Councilman for District 8. This is the Policy and Finance Committee, April 22nd, 2019, at the Law Enforcement Center. And I'd like to thank the police for loaning us the room. This is a really nice room. So I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Seconded. Motion by Brendan Jensen, council member. Seconded by Jeff Cohen. Miss City Attorney, what are we doing here today?
Thank you, Councilmember Cohen. Councilmember Jensen, we are here today because, as you know, several weeks ago, we asked the governing body if they would refer to themselves, to the Policy and Finance Committee, the item of, or the subject of, personnel code revisions. I'm not sure if you know too much about the history of it. I've found out more about it than I'd care to know, but I went back 4 decades, so we're talking about 40 years ago, and I think at that time I was a 17-year-old in high school, and that's quite a few years have passed, but 14 years ago the personnel provisions were found in the Topeka Municipal Code, and that was pre-council manager form of government. So then you have 11 years pass in 1991, and the body decided that, or actually the city council at that time decided that they would move all of those provisions that were in the municipal code into its own standalone document called the Personnel Code, which is basically what you have in front of you today. I gave you a big packet of materials that Liz graciously copied for me today. And then 30 years after that, 30 years later, came the 2004 change in the form of government. When that happened, all of the, I guess, duties and responsibilities that had been previously held by city council members, which included both policy making and administrative matters, kind of got divvied up between the governing body members who were now more policy makers and the city manager who is more the administrative officer. So the policy makers, governing body members were basically the board of directors of the company, which is the city, and then the city manager became its CEO. So he did everything that the policy makers directed him to do as far as administrative things were considered. So I guess the issue that we have, or the problem that we're seeing right now, is that since the change in the form of government in 2004, there hasn't been a lot of revisions that have been made to the personnel code as it was adopted in 1991 to kind of catch us up to where we are right now. There's lots of things in the code as it exists today that are inaccurate. Like for instance, in the very first article of the personnel code, it talks about a charter provision, A2-3, I think it is, that refers to the council having to adopt personnel rules and regulations. Well, if you go to the A2-3 in the charter, it does not have that language in it. So you have to go back further and find out, well, that got repealed back in 2004 when the form of government changed, but the personnel code wasn't revised to reflect that that had occurred. So there's lots of those types of things in the code, and it's kind of scary when you go through it because you want to make sure that you're dealing with all consistent policies, whether it's the code in conjunction with the TMC in conjunction with the bargaining unit agreements, and that's really, some of the language just isn't matching up. Like another example is, if you look in the personnel code, there's a whole article or section that deals with retirement plans, I think, and that we don't do that anymore. We don't have, retirement plans as they're referred to in the code any longer. So we really think it's time to take care of this. And I think a lot of the reason why folks maybe didn't want to do it in the past is because it is a pretty monumental task. So the 4 of us have been meeting for about a year to try to go through and identify what needs to be changed. And another component of it that's interesting, and I think you have this in your packet as well, is there's a long list of, I think it looks like this. What kind of happened is in the personnel code, there's the ability of the human resources director to go in and adopt administrative rules and regulations that's provided for in the actual code. So that has happened. And over the course of the last 15 years, you've got this long list of policies and this long list of administrative rules and regulations that have been adopted to try to, I guess, complement what's in the code, which isn't enough, I guess, to really operate the city in the way that you wish to. So you have all of these that aren't necessarily codified in the personnel code, aren't necessarily codified in this manner in the Topeka Municipal Code. So when something happens, like whether it's a grievance or what have you, these guys will have to deal with personnel items day to day, have to look at the personnel code, then they have to go look at the municipal code, then they have to go look at maybe the applicable bargaining unit agreement, then they have to go through all the administrative rules and regs, then they have to go through all the policies to make sure that they've got every piece of the equation that they might be looking into, and then try to fit all those together in making a decision that makes sense. And it's really kind of to the point where it's gotten a little bit difficult to do, and there's really no need to continue down that path if we can maybe work towards getting something put together that makes a little bit more sense. So it's more of a one-stop shop. A lot of the policies and ARRs are on the intranet, so city employees go to look at those as well. And if we change direction, then whatever document we went by would be posted on the intranet. The employees could still go to that document. It would just be more robust and comprehensive and more of a one-stop shop, as I said. So
So to oversimplify, you're basically, the goal is to come up with one document, if you will, that we basically just drop in the bargaining unit contracts under the wherever subheading they fit.
right, and you're not going to be able to do away with the bargaining unit
Right.
agreements. I mean,
Right, yeah, they
obviously,
just would
those are
plug
going to
into that
stay.
particular group of people.
But yeah, for a more overall comprehensive document that addresses some of the provisions that might not be in the bargaining unit agreements, but something that applies to everybody, we think that's probably the most logical route to go. But that's kind of part of the reason why we wanted to kick this off. We scheduled several meetings with y'all, and if you want to do this, I mean, it's going to be an undertaking, and that's why we wanted to get those dates on the calendar. But before we went further, we wanted to make sure that that made sense to you all.
So you guys already built this thing?
Well, we have, we still have the personnel code, so all of that is in place.
Right.
But all of these policies and administrative rules and regs, probably 3/4 of them were in place. But we went through every single one of those to make sure that they're the most up-to-date as they could be. And that process includes, sending them through the department directors, then sending them through a hearing process that Sean conducts with employees. It's posted, hey, these are the revisions that are being made to this existing policy or
I
ARR.
remember seeing those.
Yep.
Did you have anybody turn up?
Well, I'll let Sean speak to that one.
We did have some employees attend those meetings. They're not very highly attended by employees, but they do get the opportunity. I usually schedule 3 hearings, 3 different days, different times of the day, so that try to make it easy for employees to stop in and get those changes. Plus, I post the hearing documents on the intranet so they can see those if they're unable to attend, and then provide comments.
What were their comments?
Some just asking clarification, especially if they're in a bargaining unit. They want to make sure that I understand and they understand that the bargaining unit is first, and then if it's silent, then we go to the policies or ARRs. Sometimes they bring up good, information, or just say, hey, this is the way it's been practiced. Are you still interpreting it that way? Nothing real specific that changed those documents or changed the intention of them.
I think, Sean, too, Councilmember Cohen, a good example of where those hearings really became very useful is on the vehicle use policy. I think on that one, there were quite a few employees that kind of came, I think it was that one, I hope so,
Yes.
that showed up at the hearings and they provided input, and a lot of that input we considered and implemented. So, I mean, they do serve a very useful purpose for the folks that do show up and consider them. You know, the code's been in place, like I said, since 1991, and really between 91 and the form of government change, the only ordinances and resolutions that I could find that dealt with changes to the personnel code were just really cosmetic. It just did things like change references to the personnel director to human resources director, or it changed references to chief administrative officer to the city manager. It didn't do anything substantively to say, okay, well, these items no longer would fit under a council consideration because they're more administrative in nature. It should be considered and decided by the manager. So those are, I mean, I guess those are kind of the questions that we're just interested in your input, and as to if you think that's a good direction to look at or proceed down or not.
So a couple of questions if I can.
Councilman Jensen.
So we basically have, and my understanding is it's essentially two documents that we're working with now, the personnel code and then the policies and procedures.
Well, the policies are all individual documents.
Ah,
It's not in one document. So if you
Okay.
go to the intranet and you click on, you know, where the employees get onto, and it'll have, policies go by P101, P102, and it shows like this list.
okay.
That's what you'll find on the intranet.
Gotcha.
And then you go click on administrative. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, guys, because you know much more about it than me. But if you go to the administrative rules and regulations, you pull those up on the internet, and they're each listed as a separate document, ARR 100, 101. So it's
Okay.
these long lists, and then you can click and get to the personnel code. And then, of course, you can get on to the TMC and check what provisions are there. And I think in the TMC, the items that are covered, there's not a lot, but there's civil service for police and fire, Firemen's Relief Association, affirmative action program, benefits. And even in the TMC, they talk about workers' comp. You know, that is really a very, to me, a clearly administrative piece that I don't think any of the policymakers would want to administer work comp programs. And even when the references to work comp are made, it's an old reference. So back in the day, before I got here, and way before that, the risk manager was in the legal department. So where it's referenced in here, talks about the city attorney and risk manager shall do this. Well, long ago, the risk manager's been transferred down into Jackie's department. So
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah, we have budgetary oversight, but that's the extent, you know, the execution of that within our budgetary
Right.
restrictions is generally how, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, how that generally is handled. But, so is your intent then to scrap everything and start anew and create a new thing that will, new overarching, we're gonna have to come up with some fancy term for this, but some overarching thing that will handle all this, or to merge in, you know, take one, make it sort of the base document and merge everything into it? How do you envision moving forward?
well, I think that's part of the discussion we like to have as we go forward. Maybe next Monday, we start with just some beginning provisions, whether that's like the policy issue, Article 1 in the Personnel Code, and just say, which of these makes sense to keep, which don't? Do you want to get rid of the whole Personnel Code and make it a administrative document?
Well, what are the pros and cons of, is one basically we're quote-unquote ceding that power to the city manager versus having the council oversee it? Or, I mean, is there a particular reason we're in the situation we're now, other than it just hasn't been touched since before I was born?
I do think that largely it's a situation of it not being touched since the form of government changed, and I think that that's one of the as Lisa said, discussion points is, does there still need to be some sort of a personnel code that ultimately is adopted by the governing body, or does the governing body decide to defer that responsibility wholly to the city manager, and have him administer policies, administrative rules and regulations that encompass everything dealing with personnel?
So when the charter was crafted, when we changed the form of government, the spirit of that was that the city council, we would direct the city manager and provide budgetary oversight, but that all personnel would be handled by the city manager. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, you all are the experts at that, but that's sort of my understanding of it. So given that, I'm surprised that there's anything that still requires the council's approval in terms of personnel anyway.
You know, Councilmember Jensen, it's actually a mystery to me. It's just, when the form of government changed, and I know it would have been a monumental task, but there's so many things that really kind of should have been revised to kind of flow with that change. And for some reason, there were just gaps in what happened. I mean, some things were changed to reflect the change in the form of government, and other things just literally haven't been addressed for, 15 years. Yeah, yeah. But I know that I don't know which particular charter provision it is, but I think it's A2-25. It's in this big batch of things that we gave you for light reading. But in that provision, it's entitled Powers of the Governing Body. So it's a charter ordinance. And at the very last sentence, it says, "It shall have no administrative powers."
Right.
So
So I'm
that's
wondering
what you were
if
referencing.
even the things that are, currently assigned to us, that's probably not even really enforceable because our charter specifically doesn't give us authority over staff.
I suppose if it's in writing, you haven't changed it, you could argue you still have retained that authority, but maybe it's a question of what's administrative and what's not administrative. And some of these things,
Yeah.
personnel-related, are truly,
Business, not ours.
Yeah, and I only bring that up because
Like that.
we'll have to explain that to the rest of the governing body.
Absolutely,
When we get
yeah.
back there, this is what was intended, this is what our role should be, and this is why we hire a professional city manager who has experience in managing large organizations like this.
So if we go through this process and go through these meetings, are we going to have to hash this out with the council also? Or is this something that, everything seems to make sense at this time, then we recommend to the council that they'd approve whatever was finalized here at the committee?
yeah, the process would be that you say, yes, this is a product we think works, and then you recommend approval, or, no, we don't want to go any further with it. If you recommend approval and it goes up through the governing body for a discussion item, it might be some other subjects you're talking about now. There just might be further discussion about it at that particular level, but
Yeah.
if it
This
comes
is somewhat
through-
similar to what we did with animal control, where when we looked at one thing, we
Yeah.
realized, oh my God, the whole thing needs to be
That's right.
basically redone.
That's absolutely
Yeah,
right.
so we cracked open the whole thing and went through it and really got a quality product out of it. So the effort is definitely well worth it. I mean, if you all are up for it.
You remember how many discussions we had on animal I can't remember how many governing body discussions. we had.
4,715 hours
Hours of discussion.
for real. So, I mean, it sounds like we've got kind of a loose plan. It sounds like we need to get some sort of founding document to start with, whether it's something brand new or if we're going to take one of the existing ones and start merging changes into it. And then I'm assuming somebody has a blender, we can throw everything in and see what we get.
Yeah, I think maybe at the next meeting, which I believe is scheduled for next Monday, we can talk a little bit more maybe about best practices and get your additional thoughts on some items.
Is there any, I always hate to compare us to other cities because Topeka is a unique individual organization and community. What will other cities of our size and with our type of organization do? Is there anybody that's already, sort of gone down this road that we could look to as an example in some things?
I don't know, does anybody in HR have any of that information? I'm not sure.
I've not researched other cities' forms of how they handle their personnel code. Some have a personnel manual, and what I don't know is what's codified and what's under the administration of the city manager. So that would be something that we could certainly do some specific research on.
Well, and I don't know that it's necessary. You know, if we don't need to look to somebody else for an example, then I'm totally fine with that. But, you know, I'm all for beg, borrowing, and stealing where we can so we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
I think that's a legitimate question, though, Councilmember Jensen, because I think that'll get asked later down the road.
Okay.
So I think that's something worthwhile.
I mean,
to look
if
into.
we could steal somebody else's thesis and just put our logo on it, then, you know, save 400 hours of meetings.
So for a little bit of clarification, if I could, that's part of what we've done over the last year, though, as we were looking at existing policies and administrative rules and regs. We've also went through the personnel code, and anywhere that it referenced either the city manager making a policy or the human resources director making an admin role, we've made sure that all of those items are in place, but we've also reviewed and updated everything that was already in place. So I think a lot of the legwork has been completed already, and what we've got to decide is what's in the personnel code today that's adopted by the governing body, and whether or not those things the governing body would want to keep administrative policy-making authority, or if we wanted to then create policies and or administrative rules and regs around those things that are codified today. So that's the piece of the work that's not done yet.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why we provided you this big packet of information, because some of these things really we had to kind of pull out and find here and there and everywhere. So we put it all together for you guys so you could take a look at it and see, okay, wow, this looks really outdated, or hey, this makes sense, or whatever it is that you would like to bring to our attention next week after you take a look at it, because it's interesting. With the personnel code in particular, to me, was just interesting because there were so many things that didn't even apply anymore, period. I mean, they just didn't apply, and so much information that was just maybe, stale, but not written quite clearly.
Like what to do with bag phones instead of cell phones.
Yes, and organizationally, where you had retirement things and then you had salary things, and so it was difficult to follow. So I guess that's kind of the reason why we wanted to provide you with this, not just to bore you, but so that you could kind of take a look to see where all these things were and kind of get an idea of why we thought it maybe was something you all needed to look at, that it was an issue that was significant enough to refer to a committee, and just get maybe a idea from you next Monday what your thoughts are and what you see.
How many revisions are we talking about? Just roughly.
Hundreds, thousands?
Well, I think it kind of depends on what direction you
Yeah.
decide that you want to go. If we're going to still have a personnel code that is adopted by the governing body versus repealing in one action that code and making all things personnel under the manager. So that would be the easy thing. If there's parts and pieces that you all think still make sense to have oversight by the governing body as policymakers, then it would be going through that personnel code and figuring out what still needs to stay in place. And the code itself the personnel code is what, 72 pages or so?
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
not very
those provisions and going through and deciding what, if anything, and how to divvy those things up is the big thing.
Well, so what in this is budgetarily related? Because that's the most important function of the council, is financial oversight. So, I mean, I'm thinking of things like insurance, benefits.
The compensation system, which you might recall in 2017, you all adopted the new management and executive pay plan because that's currently in the code, but there could be a budgetary impact to that. And I think it's how, as policymakers, you view things like insurance and compensation. So part of that is the manager, one way of looking at it is the manager managing those things within the budget that's adopted by the city? And is that the policy, or is it having a policy that the governing body makes regarding those specific items, and getting a feel from you all as those policymakers as to how you would like to have that be handled?
I anticipate a lot of pushback from the council relinquishing power to the city manager.
Well, and
It's clearly his business,
Yeah.
making those decisions.
And I ask, because I don't know that we have that power anyway. I mean, we've clearly stated in the charter that all, power for staff is expressly placed with the city manager. So right now, we're in competition with each other because we have a policy that says we have no authority, but yet we have this document that has all of these things that are, quote-unquote, council required, so.
Certainly a lot of things that need to be fixed. Are we
Yeah.
going to go through items today, or are we just going to take the materials with us and review them and see you next week? or-
Nothing today to go through specifically because we thought that the information was pretty overwhelming. You probably want to take, some time to look through it first. It'll give you a better idea of our thinking when we come in, and we can just perhaps start on Monday and discuss where we want to go with it. What, as Jackie said, what items you think, if any, should be retained as part of a policy document versus putting them in a more administrative document. So,
And so all of this includes, or doesn't include any of like the discrimination policies and that sort of thing? Is it all tied up in the municipal code as well?
there's a equal opportunity.
There's an affirmative action provision in the personnel code, and we've tried to address that and it also appears in the municipal code.
In the code, yeah.
But we've also tried to address that in our personnel manual draft and our
Okay.
hiring procedures. So we've tried to do those sorts of, cross-referencing to make sure nothing that is pertinent is left out.
Because I know we have a more inclusive policy than is state law, and so some of that specifically has to be defined in municipal code in order to have that more inclusive policy.
Yeah.
And I fully support that, but that's something where I had almost assumed we would have to be left with the council because we're the ones that have passed this additional ordinance.
I think it was last year's committee discussed that as
Yeah.
part of the boundary, Shawnee County border for hiring practices.
Oh, resident?
Yeah, the residency requirement. Yeah, I think we did talk about that, and they did say that, as part of our hiring practices citywide,
Yeah.
it doesn't need to be done at that level, it's done at their level, so.
And some of those things, as we go through, it may make sense that those certain provisions that extend extra protections, for example, that it makes sense for them to stay in the municipal code, but whether or not there needs to be a separate personnel code that addresses the same thing, or based on that municipal code, does it then make sense for an administrative policy and procedure to be in place that covers what the code is set forth?
That's,
Try to make it simple. Simpler would be more preferred.
And I'm trying to think in the private sector how, when you have a CEO board organization, at what level some of that, gets approved and
Give
where.
them some general direction.
Yeah.
On the way you want the ship to go and.
Right.
you know.
Yep.
Jackie brought up the municipal code, and I think that's a good point because, the more you look at this, it makes sense just to have maybe some kind of section in the municipal code that just hits on those highlights, what you mentioned,
Yeah.
whether it's affirmative action, equal opportunity, diversity and inclusion, those types of things to have in the code under a short, personnel issues or
Yeah.
whatever
Well,
you want to call
these are our
it.
broad policies as a city, but then
Right.
how those policies are achieved is, wholly up to the city
Right.
manager and HR staff.
That wouldn't
So-
necessarily require a separate personnel code.
Right, right. So it's the general policy of the community to be inclusive, that sort of thing. Okay.
Do you all have anything else you want to
Very good.
bring up?
All right, so you guys can have this whole thing merged and ready for us to present next Monday? That would be fabulous.
Absolutely.
We'll be ready to start.
We'll see you then.
Okay, thank you
Motion to
so much for
adjourn.
your time.
Thank you. Meeting's adjourned.